Hello and good afternoon to everyone. Happy New Year's. My name is Joëlle Valabrega. I'm curator of performances and public programs here at MUDAM. And due to the current COVID situation, unfortunately, the lecture will take place via Zoom and is being live streamed. We are here today for the finissage weekend of the exhibition Post-Capital, Art and the Economics of the Digital Age, which takes as its starting point the paradox within a capitalist system and society that is both dependent upon and threatened by technological progress. The exhibition takes its title from a book that was published in 1993 entitled Post-Capitalist Society, which predicted that the impact of information technology on the labor market would be so great that it would ultimately lead to the fall of capitalism by 2020. And indeed, today, forms of labor, currency, commodities, and the nature of consumption have been dramatically transformed by technologies that continue to evolve. Big tech companies and e-commerce firms are amongst the highest valued businesses. And it's interesting to look at how these companies are not producing products, but are gathering information. Therefore, the relationship between production and consumption has shifted dramatically as we are all consciously or not involved in producing capital. Information that is both abundant and infinitely reproducible has become a valuable commodity that has modified traditional economic principles, whereby value is now determined by scarcity. And the public program of this exhibition has therefore been structured following the three sections of the exhibition and catalog, which are production, consumption, and wealth. And today's lecture will be focusing on consumption. I'm extremely honored and happy to be here today, at least metaphysically speaking, with cultural theorist Yves Citton, who will share with us new perspectives on the problem of attention in the age of technology. Citton argues that we should conceptualize attention as a kind of ecology and examine how many different environments to which we are exposed to condition our attention in different ways. And quoting Citton, another attention ecology is possible and it is already taking shape here now, but we should be aware of its limits as much as its promises. Citton is professor of literature and media at the University of Paris and director of the EUR Artec. He is co-editor of the journal Multitude and author of many publications. Following a talk, there will be a Q&A. So for those in the auditorium, please keep the questions for later. And for those attending via live stream, you can use the chat form and I will be reading the questions for you. And with no further delay, I pass on the word to Yves. Yves, thank you so much for being here.
Thank you, Joel. Thank you for the introduction, for the invitation. Apologies not to be, and regrets not to be with you in Luxembourg. Do you hear me properly? Is that okay? Should we fix something? I guess no news is good news.
No, sorry, I'm back. We do hear you very well, maybe too strongly. Okay, I will handle this from time.
I don't think I can do that here. Yeah.
I will do it. Thank you.
Should I wait a bit or should I start?
I think you can start and I will manage it in the meantime. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you very much. Again, thank you for the invitation. I think I will structure my talk around 4 moments. So I'm going to tell you in advance, and also I won't show a PowerPoint. So maybe it's going to be a bit boring to have, you said, less than an hour, hopefully 50 minutes of a talking head. I won't have a PowerPoint, but I will show you some books. So I have all piles of books, not only behind me, but around me. And instead of showing you images through PowerPoints, because I have an old computer and I don't like PowerPoints too much, I'm just going to try to show book covers. So please, Joel, tell me if you can see them or if you can't see them, or please interrupt me if you think I can do something better than what I'm doing. And my 4 themes will be first to try to share my doubts and my, my problems, uncertainties about what capital is, then about what post-capital might mean, and that's where we'll focus things on consumption maybe, and then I'm going to go to these issues of attention, as you mentioned, and that's going to be another way of thinking about consumption, not consumption in paying for some services or some goods, but reception, receiving things and receiving cultural goods or information from the point of view not of the person or the institution who emits, who produces these information, these pictures, these sound, etc., but from those of us who receive them. So that's maybe a twisted way of talking about consumption, and I will end up with 2 modes of attention that I'd like to contrast in order to try to say something about post-capital and about consumption. So first, I want to share my uncertainties about what we mean when we mention the word capital. I think it's very important to talk about capital, capitalism and so forth. I don't think we can very much go very far talking about ecologies and Anthropocene and all these things without coming to terms with this word capital, and yet I'm not sure whether it works as some sort of an idol or some religious sacred word that we think have some magical power, whether it really refers to something that we can grasp and define and fight or temper with, or if it's something that just helps us see certain things, even if we don't really know how to define it. So the first, I would give you sort of 3 moments in this discomfort with what we can do or what we can do with the word capital. First way would be to see it as a certain regime of, let's say, titles of properties and titles of properties that have led, or this regime has led historically to an incredible accumulation of wealth. And in 2020, for instance, but it could have been 2000, it could have been 1990, to extraordinary expansion of consumption. Now, in the West, I live just south of Paris, you are in Luxembourg. Most of us, not everybody in Paris, or I assume not everybody in Luxembourg, even if I don't live there, can have access to this expensive development of consumption. But a lot of us, many of us, can order things through telephone or internet, things being a pizza, being a film, being books, being travels, being things that can be very expensive and mobilize hundreds of people when we think of just booking a travel through the internet. So in a way, in the West at least, and in the West, when we belong to these affluent, sort of affluent middle class, we can be considered as consumer kings. We have incredibly more things to have access to as regular citizen, not even the billionaires of the early 20th century, 21st century, than what the kings in the even 100 years ago could afford. So there's this reality of consumption, meaning that capitalism and the accumulation of capital has led to the production of goods and services that are now available to, again, a small proportion, I guess, of the world population, but in our countries, again, not universal, but a good amount of people. Now, the criticism of capitalism very often to just say that it's not so perfect in the capitalist world is to say that, as was implicit in what I just said, that the access to this expensive consumption is not equal. So it's not equally shared within our countries, and it's not equally shared on the surface of the planet. So, and more than that, that inequalities have been rising as capitalism has been rising. The difference between Jeff Bezos' power in terms of accumulation of wealth, not only what he can afford, but what he can do with his wealth, compared to what a worker can afford, or to what a worker can do with his salary, or compared to somebody in Congo, a miner, say, somebody who goes down the mine to extract things in Congo, the difference between one and the other maybe has never been as big as what we can witness now in 2022. So, the critical narrative of this consumption of capitalism would be to say, well, it would be good if it was more equally shared. And there, you know, maybe that if you read The Economist weekly newspaper from London, as I do, even if I don't consider myself as a neoliberal, but I think it's always interesting to read The Economist to see what sort of the church of neoliberalism thinks and says. The idea is that, well, it's unequal now, but it's getting more equal. And the argument that they would take would be to say, oh, look at China, look at India. You have, as the expression usually said, is to say that you have millions of poor that have been lifted out of poverty. And China would be the example here, with the grand narrative saying, oh, nice, just a large population in China, but little by little, everybody's going to be lifted out of poverty to have access to that consumption, and capitalism will, and capital, the dynamics of capital will be justified this way, because inequalities will be reduced, or et cetera, et cetera. So in a way, this is the discourse on sort of triumphant capitalism that we've had from at least 1990s until maybe 2008, let's say. And something else has happened after that, even if, as we all know, there were many critics before that. And I will go back to what happens around 2008 later on. Just now, I want to do one third point on what capitalism. So capital is not just what allowed this dynamic of transfer of titles of properties that allowed for an accumulation of wealth that's more or less equally and acceptably shared. Capital is not wealth. If we go back to our friend Karl Marx in The Capital, it's not just having a lot of money. Having capital. Capital is, again, it's a dynamics rather than just an accumulation of things or something that allows us to produce. It's the unlimited accumulation for itself, for its own sake, that drives capital, the dynamics of capital and capitalism. So the notion of growth, the notion of increase in the returns on investment. Capital is what you invest, and you invest it in order to get more return than what you have invested. This logic here, it's very different from money. It's very different from consumption. It's this logic of reinvestment, and it's unlimited nature that I think is now being more, or at least as criticized as the inequality of the state of the world that it develops. And I think we can see a number of writers and critiques of capital that point to the limits of limits external to capitalism, external to, let's say, the economy, and these would be ecological limits to this expansion of consumption. So we can think of capital, even if we don't know what it is, and even if I'm not sure when we talk about capital whether it's very different than when we talk about Jesus Christ or about the devil, or I would be quite inclined to say that I don't really know what the devil is. Christian people maybe don't really know what the devil is, and nevertheless, it makes sense for them to use that word, or Jesus Christ. Same thing, I think, for us. Capital, I'm not sure exactly how to define it and what it is, and I haven't found so far a definition that really satisfies me on this, neither in Marx nor in the later tradition. And yet, it can help us to understand. This sort of development in investment from distant trade in the Renaissance, and then capital or capitalism already existed, but on a very thin layer of what people would do with their life, just spices and things coming from very far. Then with industrialization, etc., it came to the production of things. Most things that were produced by industrialization were produced through the logic of capital. Then most services that used to be provided on different bases have been sort of conquered or subsumed or absorbed through the logic of capital, and to the point where now we are reaching the point where human capital and our attention itself, when we talk about the attention economies, to say that capital has subsumed, has taken over, has conquered, if you want, this. Now, again, let's say we're hitting a limit. Does this limit mean that we are going towards a post-capital age? And I think that was, in a way, the premise here. Capital is exhausted capitalism. The logic, the dynamic of capital would come to a term of exhaustion. We'll see what this exhaustion might mean. And we will, de facto, like it or not, we will have to enter in an age where consumption, as we now fantasize it, and in a way as the richest of us experience it, will come to an end, and something else will happen. Other modes of consumption, limits on production, consumption, etc., etc. Now, this first, and again, I'm going to have several. I'm going to have several takes on what can post-capital mean. So the first take would be we're living the exhaustion, meaning the end of 5 centuries of a certain dynamic of expansion. The capital dynamic of expansion is reaching an end with our age. Now, what would we say if we were to substantiate that? I think one moment and one book that now is haunting a lot of us is in, and I couldn't find it. I have it here somewhere, but I couldn't find it. I apologize. It's Meadows and Meadows, the Club of Rome report, Limits to Growth, the Limits to Growth, 1972, which precisely said, oh, there are limits. Whether you're socialist, whether you're communist, whether you're whatever, there are limits to growth in the way we use fossil fuels, etc., etc. Now, we're very familiar with this thing. So the first thing would be to say, either through Limits to Growth in 72, or through the word Anthropocene, or through the COP, Conference of Parties in Paris in 2015, etc., etc. All these moments are moments where we come to terms with the fact that there are limits to this expansive dynamic of capitalism and investment, certain ways of investment and consumption. Now, one way to say it is to say that capitalism is ecocidal. It it is a factor of ecocide. It's very dynamic, does destroy our environment. And one good book, I think, for this is this book that I'm showing now, which is by Christopher Wright and Daniel Nyberg, Climate Change Capitalism Corporation. And I really like the subtitle, Processes of Creative Self-Destruction. So obviously it's a reference to the notion of creative destruction or destructive creation, or that capitalism destroys old modes of production in order to make room for new modes of production to have. And instead of creative destruction, we have creative self-destruction. And I think that's what a lot of us feel now. This exhaustion of resources means that what we consume, we destroy the very conditions of living. Our consumption is destroying our very conditions of living. And there could be another book on this, which is not that recent. I think it was in the 90s, 2006, by Ramachandra Guha. How much should a person consume? Ramachandra Guha, how much should a person consume? And this clearly asks what I was starting with. Well, people in the United States, I guess in Luxembourg and in Paris, we are consuming more than the share that can be renewed, that can be produced without destroying our living milieu, or no milieu de vie, the milieu where our life can be sustained. And Ramachandra Guha proposed to see three new classes. The class where I started with Marx, and the working class, the proletariat versus the capitalist. Said, well, there are different classes that we should think of when we mention these, when we approach it through these limits to consumption and limits to production. These would be the omnivore classes, of which we belong. We eat everything. Whatever there is to eat, we eat. And we consume too much and we destroy. There would be the other class of the sort of autochthon indigenous population, people who have lived in a certain way, sustainable way, because it's been sustained for centuries and centuries without, of course it evolves, of course there are changes and so forth, but it seemed to be sustainable for years, and little by little their forests are taken over, their modes of life are being destroyed. And the third class would be what he calls climate refugees. Because of this destruction, more and more people will have to migrate, will have to move, and this is the third big class of the century ahead. So Ramachandra Guha, I think if we think of consumption, that's for me, that's a not so young, but very interesting book. And all of that says is that capitalism, as it develops now, and as it develops a certain mode of consumption, is ecocidal, destroys the ecosystems by exhausting our resources. We'll see that later on with the notion of collapse and collapsology. And also with an accumulation of toxic waste, whether it is carbon dioxide, whether it will be nuclear waste, et cetera, or pesticides and so forth. Now, there's another way to approach a necessarily post-capitalist age in which we might enter. It's to say that not only is it ecocidal, destroys our ecosystem, but it could be said as egocidal. It destroys our ego, it destroys our subjectivity, it destroys our personality. And this, there's a book in French, I don't think it's been translated, by Dominique Quesada. It might be hard to see, that's his name, and this is the title of the book, La Société de Consommation de Soi, the society of self-consumption, consuming oneself. That not only do we consume resources that won't be renewed and that will generate shortage because we won't have enough later on, or that brings pollution that will make our ecosystems unlivable, but we consume ourselves. The exhaustion is not only of external resources, but I don't know about you, but I very often feel exhausted in the sense of too many solicitations, too many things to do, talking about burnout and all these things. Now it's quite common, unfortunately. And there's another limit to this expansion of consumption and production, etc., which is not only outside but inside, and we'll see that again. That brings us closer to issues of attention. But this notion of society of self-consumption, I think it's quite interesting. There's another book that I really like. This one is in English, or even if it's translated from Italian. It's by Silvio Lorusso. Entrepreneuriat, between entrepreneur and precariat, with this subtitle or whatever that you can see now. And it is, in a way, it's more recent. I think it's 2018 or something like that, 19. And it is also describing the self-exhaustion of working energies in a world that is made artificially precarious by a certain development of neoliberalism, of capitalism, etc., etc., etc. So, ecocidal and egocidal. Now, does that mean that, as I said earlier, and I think as maybe implicit in the very notion of post-capital, when we talk about something being post, it means it comes after, so that capital would be defeated or would collapse or would vanish, and post-capital age would bring something entirely new. I'm not so sure about this take on post-capital, and therefore I will suggest something else, which is that we have already lived for quite a while with post-capital dynamics. I described so far the dynamics of capital. I describe, of course, very briefly and very superficially and not very seriously. But along with this development of a certain dynamics of capital, there were already, call it anti-capitalist or anti-capitalist, because some of them might have been there before, or post-capitalist, because these are the ones that we need to develop now in order to face the problems I just mentioned. So the second take on this post-capital thing would be, we have lived in post-capital dynamics for a long time. Where would we see them? And that's what we try to develop in the journal that Joel was kind enough to mention, the journal Multitude, where I'm part of the redaction. And we did an issue called precisely post-capitalism with a question mark. And that was in 2018. That was issue number 70. Where precisely we were trying not so much to have a prophecy on the end of capitalism, but on noticing what was already post-capitalist in the current, in different parts of the world at the current age. And there you could see, and I'm going to go quick on that because I want to come to my issues of attention, but you could see, and a lot of people describe capitalism as having had to exhaust itself much earlier. If there hadn't been workers' resistance, if there hadn't been trade unions, socialist parties, communist parties fighting it and forcing these dynamics of capital to bring something like a welfare state, to bring something like a non-capitalist way of producing resources, producing goods and services, sharing them, redistributing them, etc. So post-capital has been, or non-capital has been necessary for capital to develop as it did, which raises the question again on this post-capital as being after. We all know that there is a very amazing, I would say, capacity for capital to absorb its resistance, to absorb what is opposed to it, what resists to it, and to reconfigure it in order to sustain. So I think that's either a risk or a perspective that at least we should consider. Second point, to say that maybe we already live in a post-capital age, and these are sort of other writings on the fact that today's finance financial world. And I guess you're more aware of that in Luxembourg than I am here in Paris, maybe. But some people help us see that maybe finance, which could be sort of the epitome or the beating heart of capital, maybe it's already post-capital or post-capitalist. And there's one book, and a writer who unfortunately is dead, Randy Martin. I think he died maybe 2, 3, 5 years ago. Randy Martin, he published a book on the financiarization of everyday life, and he published this truly amazing book called Knowledge Ltd. And I have to see towards a social logic of the derivative. And Randy Martin with Knowledge Ltd. And with other project that he had, and not just by himself, but along with a whole set of people who thought about derivatives in sort of political, financial, not just financial, but political and anthropological, I would say, terms. Let me at least to see that we can consider derivatives, right? These titles that are built, again, these are sort of titles of properties, but it's difficult to see whether they're titles of properties or title of insurance. Betting for this thing to happen, or for this price to go down, or for an earthquake to arrive here, or all these investment. Again, these are title properties, these are sort of his investment, but they're investments to a second or third or 50th degree derivative from what should be the substance of value, and the huge development in finance of this derivative. Randy Martin tells us, oh, we should see that as a meta capital. It's not just capital, it's meta capital. It does to capital what capital has been doing to money or to wealth. And we already live in a different world. Just for one reason, because it dilutes property. Who owns these things? Well, you have so many things that are added on that we saw in the subprime crisis of 2008, that nobody really understood what was happening, who owned what, and who was in trouble because this thing collapsed or not. And again, it's not socialism, but capitalism needed the nation state and sort of socialist measures in order to save this fucking up of the derivative thing, meta capital. So that's one way to say that maybe we're already out of capitalism now. Another very interesting book that I would recommend, it's by Michael Faher. It's been published both in French with a different title, I don't remember now, and in English. It's Zone Books. Michel Faher is one of the editors of Zone Books. It's called Rated Agency, Investee Politics in a Speculative Age. And in a way, I would group him with Randy Martin and these people telling us, we think we still live in capitalism, but it would take very little to see that the heart of capital, which is finance, is already post-capital. And how does he build that? He built that on the notion of investees, in urging us to change one use of word. Whenever we used debtor, people who have debts, you're indebted because you did a college degree in the US and you are $200,000 in debt, or because you bought a house and the bank bought the house for you and so forth. Usually we say we are debtors, and we think of the debtors as having this obligation to repay every month what he owes, and that sort of can strangle him, and he's a new form of slavery because you are subjected to the people who loaned you the money, and they can take your house away from you, etc., 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 which I guess it's also true. But Michel Fayer tells us, well, let's look at it in another way, which doesn't deny the first way, but just adds another layer to that. And to say, well, all these people who have debts, they are investees. If they have debt, people have invested in them. And as we all know, when you invest your capital or your money or whatever in something, well, you may lose it. So there is a power of the invested or the investees, and we don't use that power. But if we were more aware of it, and if investees or debtor would find a way to co-ally to coagulate, to form organization, they would have an amazing power to turn around certain dynamics of capital. And finally, a last word on this fact that we may already live in a post-capital age. This is a book by Mackenzie Wark, and it's the title is quite explicit. Capital is dead. Is this something worse? So I really like it because it it goes with the idea we live in a post-capital age because capital is dead, but maybe what comes after could be not so much the revolution and the classless society, but something even worse. And what he described, and he's been describing him as far as 2004 in the Hacker Manifesto, is to say, again, there are other form of class composition that are coming, that are installing with the digital age and networks and all that, which he calls the vectorialist class. Those who own or control the vectors of communications, and the hacker class, those who provide images, sounds, ideas, narratives, information to the networks. And we have to think in a new form of class struggle, not to abolish the previous one, but just to come on top of the previous one, which is not only between capitalist and proletariat, or whatever you want to call it, but between this vectorialist class and the hacker class. And a lot of things I think that happen now with platform capitalism and so forth make sense when we look at it from Mackenzie Wark's. So what we have here is the idea that certain things coexist already with the dynamics of capital in our phase now in 2022. They can be called, again, post-capital if we want, and I think it's a good way to see them, but they're already here. And the fact that they're already here, for better or for worse, doesn't mean that capital will just vanish or exhaust itself right away. Now, I want to, for the last 20 minutes or 25, I want to focus, if you want, on one very particular, maybe very weird aspect of this debate or these very broad issues. And this is linked to issues of attention, to modes of attention. So I've been working on attention. I published a book called the Attention Ecology, where I was interested in trying to make sense of what do we mean when we talk about attention now. There's an attention economy. There are neuroscientists tell us things about attention. So I try to understand that field of questioning. And now I'd like to use it to rethink consumption, since it's in the theme of what you're doing now in the museum and in this series, from the point of view of attention as a way to receive. Again, not just information. Usually we say information, but images are much more and very different than just information. Narratives are something else than information, etc. So how we receive these things, in a way, how we consume them, not just because we pay for them, but because we absorb them, just like we eat, we consume an apple. When we eat the apple, well, our eyes and our ears and our senses and our brain and our nervous system absorbs narratives, absorbs images, films, etc. How do we consume them, and how studying these issues of attention maybe can help us, again, do the work that I was trying to do now, to see a capital dynamics in what we do in attentional terms, and a post-capital dynamics translated also in post-capital terms. And these two modes of attention that I'd like to describe now, I will call them, for the first one, an extractivist mode of attention. That in a way continues what capital has been doing to us, for better and often for worse. And I will call the other one a collapsonaut mode of attention. And I'll try to justify these terms. So the first one, extractivism. Now, I don't know how familiar you are with the word extractivism, which is quite used nowadays in certain circles, but maybe not universally. So I will spend some time, with apologies for those who are familiar with it, trying to bring my definition so that we can agree on something. The idea for me in extractivism is to say that, well, it's even more interesting to talk about extractivism than to talk about capitalism. Why? One of the reasons is that it's hard for me to think that the Soviet Union from the 1920s up to the 1980s was a capitalist system. I don't think people would say that. And yet what was happening in the Soviet Union towards the environment, I think was not so different and so much better than what could have been happening in capitalist regimes. So when we go for extractivism, we try to find something that may be even deeper than just a critique of capitalism, even if a critique of capitalism is clearly part of it. Now, what do we mean by extraction or extractivism? So extraction, first, it would be just to go underground and extract coal from the mine. Historically, that's the notion, obviously. But here, in more abstract terms, I would define it through three different features. First feature, it is a mode of attention because it means looking at our surrounds, looking at our environments, only to find resources in it. And that would be the sentence. What's in it for me? Okay. What can I extract of it that would give me pleasure, give me money, give me whatever? So extractivism in that sense is to look at the environment from the point of view of what resources are there and what resources I could extract. First feature. Second feature, and again, it's an intentional mode. I don't pay attention. So I pay attention to things as resources, but I don't pay attention to the renewability of these resources. I neglect that. Okay, I elect things that can be resources, used as resources, but I neglect the fact of their renewability. Typically, what we did in 150 years is to extract fossil fuels that had taken millions of years to compose, to be produced through geology. And we didn't just extract every year what would be renewed by sort of the natural production of oil and of coal and of that. Otherwise, we would have extracted a very little bit. We just extracted in a century and a half things that had taken millions of years. So we didn't ask the question, oh, should we take just enough so that we have, no, renewability was not taken into, was not relevant, so it was neglected. And that's the second feature of extractivism. The third feature of extractivism being that we didn't pay attention either, not just to renewability, but to collateral damage, I would say. People would say externalities, negative externalities, but I think another way to say is just collateral damage. And typically, again, with fossil fuels, not only we extracted more than was renewed by the reproduction of it, but we didn't pay attention to the fact that it was having as a side effect the emission of carbon dioxide. And now we are realizing that this emission of carbon dioxide is just a side effect of running cars and planes and all that, but it's destroying our living milieux. It's the part of the ecocide I was telling you. So extractivism would be defined by these three features. And that's, you can see that extractivism is what makes consumption a form of exhaustion. Okay? We are exhausting external resources. And I said earlier, we are exhausting ourselves, because you could also say of extractivism in order to think of what Facebook or what Google do with our attention. Okay, they have an extractivist treatment or processing of our attention, again, to sell advertisement, to make profit, etc. So this extractivism is what exhausts our outside environment and our inner self, maybe. Now, this focusing on extractivism, I think it accounts for, or it helps us see how the word Anthropocene is not very satisfactory, because it's as if all of mankind was responsible for what was happening. Again, as I said earlier with Ramachandra Guha, it's not the case. So we can talk about Capitalocene, and Capitalocene, again, I think it's a very interesting word to use, but certain people talk about Plantationocene, plantation, for the plantation. And here there's a book that I guess most of you are familiar with, Anat Singh, The Mushroom at the End of the World, with, as its subtitle, On the Possibility of Life in Capitalist Ruins. And she's with Donna Haraway, with several other people, among those people who help us see our current age as Plantationocene. And what does it mean, Plantationocene? It means the plantation, the slave plantation in the 17th, 18th century in the Caribbean, for instance, was built on slavery. And slavery is precisely a horribly extractivist mode of treating or mistreating human beings, reducing them to resources. So we're familiar with the horror of the plantation in terms of slavery, but it's also a certain treatment of the environment. It's what do you do when you do a plantation? You just have a tabula rasa. You destroy the ecosystem that was here and you plant sugarcane or cotton or coffee or whatever you want. And this monoculture, Anna Tsing or others tell us, this is the root of, or this is one of the main causes of what is destroying our environment. And so even if we don't have slave plantations in the 21st century, even if I'm not sure when I eat my tomatoes and they come from south of Spain, if it's not another form of plantation, not only because it's monocultural, but because who works there? Often it's African illegal migrants who are underpaid and exploited. So maybe we still live with plantations in the sort of neo-slavery type. But even if it wasn't the case, even in Canada, when people plant trees in Canada and they're not slave when they plant these trees, they're treated decently, the human beings, the monoculture of planting all these trees in the name of greenery and ecology and forest planting and so forth may be very destructive also because of the very assumption of monoculture. So the Plantationocene, I think there's another very interesting book. It's in French, unfortunately, but for those of you who read French, I really recommend it, by Malcolm Ferdinand, Une écologie décoloniale, who really develops this link between ecology and colonialism and putting the Plantationocene at the heart of this. Now, why, I will skip on other things because I don't want to finish too late. What does it have to do with attention? So I think we already saw the way I defined extractivism as paying attention to certain things, everything is resources, and not to others. What is more frightening in a way, it is that the way psychology, the way the neurosciences define human attention, they define human attention, I think, when I read them, as being extractivist. What do they tell us? They tell us standard attention consists in sort of scanning whatever is around you, and you know that our eyes do this very sort of constantly, in order to find dangers, possible threats, and that works because if something comes my way, I will avoid it if everything goes well. So in a way, we're alive because we have learned with our attention to scan our environment, to notice things that can be threatening or things that can be profitable. And so it's sort of built in our nervous system to have this extractivist approach, resources. Or another way to call it is to say affordances. And again, to say affordance is to say what's in it for me. Typically, if you see that, if you are sort of neurotypical person as the neurosciences observe us, you see that and you have this gesture already ready in your hand, because when we see that, we call it a cup and it's made to drink, to be caught like this and to drink. So this is human made, but we can say that we have just learned, we trained ourselves to look at the world. Or wood, it's something that you can cut, that you can either make pull or burn or whatever. So we are normal, we are neurotypical insofar as we have developed this extractivist mode of attention. Now, to finish, what would be a non-extractivist mode of attention? Is it possible? Is it, what would it be? And that's what I would call a collapsonaut mode of attention. Now, yeah, I've gone through a number of things. Maybe we'll go back to them later. Just a word on collapse. You may be familiar with that very popular book by Jared Diamond, Collapse. I think it's 2008 or 2000 something, early 2000s. How societies choose to fail or succeed, whatever, I don't find it, but I think it's 2008. So there's been sort of a trend of looking at how previous societies have collapsed and how that might happen to us for plenty of reasons, because it's too complex, because we don't have enough resources, etc., etc. In France, it became, in the French-speaking world, I guess, in Switzerland, Belgium also, but not in Italy, for instance, or Spain, as far as I know, and I think it's sort of a French peculiarities. A number of books have been very popular to talk about possibilities of collapse, the most popular being Pablo Servigne and Raphael Stevens, Comment tout peut s'effondrer. It was 2015, I think, in French, and it's just been translated into English in 2020, and that was a huge bestseller in France. They published another book whose title I really love, Une autre fin du monde est possible, playing with Un autre monde est possible, well, Une autre fin du monde est possible. And it has developed into what is called collapsology. Collapsology, the science, if you want, of collapse. And it has certain people who also are part of it. Yves Cochet. Yves Cochet was a French minister of the environment in the early 2000s under Jospin government, I think. And he's one of the main collapsologists. And he published this book, Devant l'effondrement. And you see the title, Le compte à rebours a commencé, count down his arm. That's the banner. Okay, so Devant l'effondrement. And people like Cochet tell us, oh, they even predict sometimes, oh, it's going to be at least before 2030 or 2045, et cetera, et cetera. And they describe the collapsing of what? Because the way collapse is described is, it's not just, oh, everything falls apart, is the social services, the public legal services that provide us with food, basic necessities, protection, health, etc., that these institutions that legally provide that may collapse because of shortages, because of different reasons, because of the exhaustion we saw earlier of our resources. Now, this science of collapse, collapsology, in the latest book, Une autre fin du monde est possible, Servigne and his friends used another word, which is collapsonaut. And a friend of mine, Jacopo Rasmi, and I, we recycled that word in a book we called Génération Collapsonaut. And the difference is to say this is not so much a science of how things are going to collapse, because I don't know whether they are, I don't know how, and I don't think it's a science anyway, but sort of an art of navigating, of continuing to stay afloat in a world that's already crumbling, in a world that's already exhausted, in a world that's already in part collapsing, and that has been collapsing for many decades or many centuries, because in the colonies, people have lived through collapse when European people came. So in a way, collapse, it's not something in the future. It's just like this notion of post-capital. No, it's not post-capital. It's much at the root of capitalism. Now, this is for collapse. Now, what about a collapsonaut attention? And I'll conclude on this. How to contrast this extractivist mode of attention, which in a way, I'm saying it right away, I don't think we can just forget it. I don't think we can just nullify it or be out. I think it's very deep in the way we behave with our environment. So this is there. I don't think it's going to vanish. But what we can do is develop more, give more power, give more strength, nurture more, another mode of attention that will be able to counterbalance this extractivist mode of attention. Now, what would that mean? I think that would mean paying attention to the ground as ground, to the background as background. Now, what does it mean? And here again, I'm going to show you a few books. This is a French translation. You may be familiar with David Abram's book in English. It's called The Sensuous Spell. The Sensuous Spell. It's a fantastic book. I think end of the 90s in French. Comment la terre s'est tue. And he tries to show, to make us feel how, for instance, shaman in certain societies have developed a certain feel, a certain sensibility to environmental states, to environmental conditions, etc., and were capable of translating these environmental, ambiental state or mind or spirit or whatever to the community. And so I think this would be one example to say, we, instead of just focusing, which is the extractivist mode of attention. Remember how I defined it? I said, oh, you look at things in terms of resources. You have to focus. Oh, there is coal, and I'm going to extract coal. There is oil. There are carrots. There are drinking water, etc., etc. So the way we think of attention usually, it is concentration. It is focusing on something. The challenge of collapsonaut attention is to make yourself sensitive to the ground, to the environment, to the ambience, to the surround. And we don't know how to do that. Why? Because very often we think of attention through our eyes, through the visual sense. And it's very difficult not to focus on something with our eyes. If you think of the senses of smell, well, it stinks. When we say it stinks, we don't necessarily know what stinks or where it comes from. Just in the air, there is something in the air and it stinks. This is much closer to being sensitive to the ground, being sensitive to the environment itself. So I think what we have to learn is to redefine attention, not just in visual terms. Being attentive to is focusing on, but sensing things in the sense, in French, sentir, it's also to the sense of smell. So to be sensitive to the environment as such, or the background or the surround as such. Instead of only seeing figures, we would be sensitive to textures. And this is something that Brian Masumi and Erin Manning have developed in the first chapter of this fantastic book called Thought in the Act. And the first chapter is called Coming Alive in a World of Textures, Coming Alive in a World of Textures. And it describes people that have been categorized as artists. And it tries to understand what's the difference between the neurotypical form of attention and what, again, is stigmatized as artistic form of attention. And one of the main difference they see is neurotypical people scan the world to have affordance. What can I do? Can I take it? Can I drink? Can I use it for that? And that non-neurotypical attention would be more to be sensitive to textures. And that would be very important. So that's one way to look at it, to make ourselves sensitive to textures, to ambiances, to entanglements. And finally, to make ourselves sensitive to also, well, aesthetics, I will say it this way. I was talking about sensing, about different ways of just going around turning around the issue. But I just will mention two more books in French. I don't think they've been translated, unfortunately. One by Jean-Marie Schaeffer, and it's called L'Expérience Esthétique. And I think it's interesting, since we're in a museum after all, that Jean-Marie Schaeffer defines a non-standard, I would say non-extractivist, a non-standard form of attention, which he calls aesthetic attention, in very complex and beautiful ways. He talks about a delay of categorization. I don't have time to enter that, but the way I would integrate it in my collapsonaut attention, it's precisely, it's an alternative to the standard or the extractivist mode of attention. And what we do when we go to museums is not just to identify, oh, this is a Virgin Mary, this is a tree, this is a bridge, this is a portrait of a man. Well, we notice that, so we see these figures, but we try to make ourselves attentive to something else. And Schaeffer also used it in a word of investment. It's non-economical, it's non-capitalistic in the economical way. We invest more than what we know will come in terms of return. And it's a different form of investment, not money, obviously, but differently. Another book on attention, which is very important. It's again, I think, unfortunately not translated. Nathalie Deprat, Attention et Vigilance, and also the way, in terms of phenomenology, the way she defines attention. Very, very precise and beautiful. It's precisely, I think, an alternative to this instrumental extractivist mode of attention. I had other books, that maybe just one more, since I have maybe 3 more minutes to go. So what I'm saying is capital has developed over 5 centuries. Along the way, other things have either survived or have been generated as opponents, in a way, to capital, or alternative to capital. We may think of post-capitalism as the victory of these alternatives, and it will just destroy capital, or I think it might be more realistic to think of it as inner alternatives that have been here but have been neglected, need to take over without necessarily destroying it. Because again, if we think in terms of attention, I don't think this extractivist mode of attention can be just dispensed with. So reevaluate or collapsonaut attention. I try to define this way. Maybe if you have questions, we can go back to this. Nevertheless, there is something that I think has to be thought in terms of destruction, or I rather think in terms of subtraction rather than destruction. And there's a better word even for that. I think it's the word dismantlement. And here, and that'll be my last book for today. It's a fairly recent book by Emmanuel Bonnet, Diego Landivar, and Alexandre Monin. Again, I don't think, one article by Alexandre Monin will be translated because we translated it in multitude, but the book is called Héritage et Fermeture. So to inherit and to close down. And the subtitle is Une écologie du démantèlement, an ecology of dismantlement. What do they mean by that? First, they introduce a fantastic concept, and I just throw it to you. I won't have time to work with it, but it's just beautiful. I think it's scary, but beautiful as a concept, is the notion of negative commons. What's a negative common? Usually when we think of commons, we think of either the land or drinkable water or clean air or the language, all these things that are produced by collective intelligence or produced by nature, et cetera, and that can be appropriated or should be preserved as commons, et cetera. But it's always positive. It's always good things that when we think of commons, we think of good things. Well, they tell us, no, we should also think of negative commons. Nuclear waste are a typical example of negative commons. CO2 in the atmosphere, what's been building up now over the 20th century, well, these are commons. It's all of mankind, and non-humans also, but for us, all of mankind are subjected now to climate change. It is a common, but it is a negative common. But nevertheless, we have to think of it in terms of commons. Now, what they describe in To Inherit and to Close Down is that what feeds us nowadays, and all I said earlier about capitalism and consumption, this accumulation of wealth, etc., and us, especially in the richer world, well, the way our food is produced, the way our food travels to come to our neighborhood or to our plate, all of this, it's mostly driven by capital, and we depend on it. This is negative commons. It pollutes our milieu, but it feeds us. It's the same thing that feeds us, that destroys our milieu. In French, it's good because you can say nourrir, to feed, and pourrir, to rot, to fuck up. So it's the same thing that nourrit and that pourrit our milieu. So we can just abolish it. We can just say, oh, forget it. Logistics, it's a bad idea. No, we can just build our little garden in a week and be self-sufficient, etc. So we have to dismantle. And the challenge now, and I'll close on this, I think that one of the many political challenges is to use this collapsonaut attention to make ourselves sensitive to what extractivism has desensitized, which is renewability, which is collateral damages, externalities, etc., etc. But it's not just externalities, as Mona and company say. These negative comments are not just externalities. They're not just a side effect that we could get rid of. They're part of the core system that produces our modes of living now. So the activity of dismantlement of what rots our environment within what feeds us is, I think, one of the most urgent political challenges of this collapsonaut tension. And I'll stop on that because I've gone through my hour. Joel, if you want to take over.
Hello, do you hear me?
I can.
Yes? Okay. Well, thank you so much. You made extremely complicated themes seem very easy and accessible for everyone. So thank you very much. Before we start the Q&A, I'm going to start maybe by the questions online. So first question is from Caroline. Yves, thank you. During Helen Hester's lecture in October, we discussed the following statement. Technology is as social as society is technological. Can you relate to this statement, and what are your thoughts about it?
Yes, thank you very much for mentioning Helen Hester. One of the books that I prepared here wasn't by Helen Hester, unfortunately, although I have feminist, Xenofeminist manifesto behind me. But it's a book where I think she's quite also collaborating with somebody called Benjamin Bratton. And we just published a French translation. So this is not the original. The original is called Terraforming, The Terraforming 2019 by Benjamin Bratton. And it's by Strelka Institute. We did a translation in French with an afterword from Lionel Manga, who comes from Cameroon. And we thought it was important to look at these issues of technologies and terraforming and the relation between societies and technologies as Bratton, and in a way, Helen also presents it from the point of view of somebody looking at it, not from San Diego, not from Paris, not from Moscow, but from Cameroon. So yes, obviously, I don't think I mentioned the word technology in my whole speech, which is quite terrible. For 1 hour, I didn't even mention that. But of course, it's central. When I talk about negative comments with Alexandre Monin and his buddies, it is to place political questions at the infrastructural level. It is these infrastructures that feed us and rot us at the same time, that feed us and exhaust us at the same time. And it is at the level of technological devices, not at all to demonize them. Technology is not the demon. It's not because of Gestalt that now we're all fucked up. No, technology is part of the human development. Even just writing is a form of technology. So I think we should be very wary of not just having this easy guilty party, which would be just technology and let's go back to nature. At least I don't believe in that. And Benjamin Bratton is very clear, maybe even too polemic on this. But if you want to just criticize that, I think that's a very strong point that he makes. And yet, the notion of dismantlement for me was precisely addressing this, even if you're right, it was silly not to talk about technology. Dismantlement means technology is in a way the mantle, that the manteau in French. I'm not sure what mantle means in English. I know it's the fireplace, but I don't know what else it means. But in French, at least, the manteau is also what protects us. So in a way, technology is what feeds us, what protects us from a lot of things. Just from in the winter, in our cold countries, well, we need gas burners and things, electricity to protect us from being exposed to freezing cold. So technology is dismantled. We can't just get rid of it. We have to dismantle and remantle it differently. So if your question was, this collapsonaut attention, is it just a return to natural environment and forgetting about technology? Absolutely not, in my view, at least. Yes, society is as technological as technology is social, and it is just part of a world. So we have to reconfigure, we have to filter again the technologies that we inherit. That's the title of the book. Close down some of them and develop others. But it's clearly not a demonization of technology. Thank you very much for making this very clear.
And then always linked to, I mean, the question of technology and society. So first you quoted Mackenzie's book and the different forms of classes in our society. So if once the dominant ruling class was defined by the ownership of land, then it became the ownership of capital and production. And we are now sort of in a shift, which is the gathering of information, as I was saying before. So I was just wondering if you can predict or if you have an idea of what the dominant ruling class may be owning from here to 50 years. Meaning, like, if we will get over technology somehow, what will be next?
Well, first, I have no pretense of being able to predict anything. I'm sorry, I don't have such a high esteem in my intelligence. I'm trying to understand what happens, now we're not over technology. I think what I was trying to say is that the forms of power that exist now, in terms of political power, even nation states. I don't particularly like and praise sovereignism and nation state, but I don't think either they will vanish just like that. The power of capital as we used to know it, even if I said now, oh, look at what happens with derivatives, it's more complex, etc., there is still the power of capital. I mean, what you call this US chain that I forgot the name now, where a family owns most of it, Walmart, I think. Well, these forms of capital, they continue to exist. So I think these forms of power will be there. What Mackenzie work helps us see, at least helps me see, is these mixed forms of power that are the vectorialist class, because the vectorialist class, yes, it is Bezos or the guy who owns Microsoft and all these things, because they own whatever cables, or they own patents, or they own things. But it's also a journalist, a very sort of popular journalist, who decides who gets to be on his show or not to be on his show. He may not be a millionaire. He may not own the channel, but he controls the vector of what goes online or what does not go online. All the influencers, it may happen to go together. We know with the attention economy is that the attention economy and the money economy very much go together. But conceptually, I think we can try. So yes, there are forms of power that have developed through mass media in the 20th century, through now sort of new forms of hybrid media like social media in the 21st century, and these are new forms of power. If we believe, and I partly do so, the projection or the prediction, if you want, of our friend collapsologist, and I think this is a strong intuition, there will be maybe a coming back to more immediate material power of just providing food and providing energy, which in a way has been, at least in our imaginaries, I don't think at all in the way of the real way of the were real working of the economy, but in our imaginaries with all the things about, oh, the virtual and the digital and all that, and even the attention economy, people like Goldhaber in the 1990s, when they said, oh, the attention economy will take over or will be more powerful than the traditional economy, meaning the economy of goods or economy of money and so forth. I think this was a very interesting but very foolish moment in neglecting precisely these infrastructures that we were talking about earlier. It's at the level of the infrastructure, and the infrastructure of just providing food and providing water, that even if the power has always been there, we have tended to forget how immediately powerful this is, and how mediated it is also, this infrastructure, and that this mediation of the infrastructure to provide basic elements of sustenance. I think this we will realize more and more how much power is there, and how conflictual the power, and how it needs to be conquered in a way, these forms of power. I don't know if that answers your question, Joel. It wasn't very, maybe I wasn't that on the spot.
Yes. Oops. Yes, thank you. Are there any questions from the audience? No, okay, then I continue with the questions from the online. 1 second, sorry.
While you're looking, I'm just showing one more thing, because it's for consumption. It's for consumption. I want you to consume the new issue of Multitude. It's on planetarité, and precisely we have a text by Bratton. We have text by Bruno Latour, Jennifer Gabris, Frédéric Nera. Who else? Yes, somebody, Holy Jean Buck, a little bit, a translation of her work. Alexandre Monin was talking to, and it's all about, Alexis Pauline Gums, and it's all about this notion of planetarité, meaning the different ways to look at the earth, the world, Gaia, geopolitics, etc., etc. We try to organize these and define these different layers. And precisely, I think one of the common message is to put the emphasis on the political nature of the infrastructure and the infrastructural nature of politics in the age of planetarity. The age of planetarity being defined as the moment where we look at our planet. Terraforming by Bratton is very much at the center of this, is to say we are led, because of climate issues, we are led to look at our planet as we used to look at other planets. Planet Mars, for instance, is it inhabitable? To which condition could we inhabit planet Mars? Now, because we fucked up this planet, this environment, we are questioning our future in terms of the habitability, not of planet Mars, but of planet Earth. And this is a way, a need for an alternate, another terraforming. That's the Bratton's project. And that's what we try to put at the center of this discussion on planetarity. Sorry, now you may have I guess your question is ready.
Thank you. Last question from Michelle is, I often have the feeling that art and the museum in its traditional form increasingly struggles to engage audiences who are becoming accustomed to what you describe as very different forms of investment. Can art and museum counter the extractivist mode of attention?
Well, thank you very much. Again, I will say, I don't know if they can in the long run, if there will be museums 2,000 years, 200 years from now, if there will be anything 200 years from now, as far as we're concerned, I don't know. I can predict that. I think that where is this book? I think that if you don't know the book, you should look at Jean-Marie Schaeffer. I think it's people have criticized his take because his definition of aesthetics is, in a way, it's precisely the museum, the traditional museum experience where you go, you have the time, you look at a painting, then you look at the other painting, and you sort of contemplate, and you think. Whereas people have told me, oh, but aesthetic experience can be a rave party. And a rave party is very different from what he describes as an aesthetic experience. So there might be limits to what he says, but it's a very dense and precise analysis of what it is that we do when we go to a traditional museum. And I think it convincingly shows that this is something terribly important in the sort of social reproduction and transformation and adaptation of human life. So in a way, it's also what we may be doing in a classroom, in a seminar room. That's what we may be doing in a lot of other places than museum. But clearly art is in terms of attentional experience. And here we should maybe distinguish the attentional experience of the artist, producer of the work, and of the spectator, viewer of the work. And we should also distinguish between the spectator, viewer of the work, and the listener when you go to a concert, and et cetera, et cetera. So we really have to talk about the arts in the plural and various modes of attention in the plural, depending on the arts, depending on which school of art, et cetera, et cetera. So it has to be very much a multitude and a plurality. And it's hard to say, oh, we need art for this or for that in general. Nevertheless, this type of what he calls delay, I'm just going to go very briefly into the little mechanic that he gives us. He talks about delay of categorization. What is the aesthetic experience as he defines it? Is to say, you look at something, maybe you recognize, again, Virgin Mary on the painting, but you keep investing your energy after you have recognized something. Whereas the standard extractivist attention would be, well, you recognize and either you can profit, what's the affordance, what can you do with it? Or is it a danger? And that Virgin Mary, you can profit, you can't, it's not really a danger if you're not Christian or whatever. So no interest. You go to the next one, because maybe the next one you'll learn something or you'll find something. No, here in the aesthetic experience, you keep looking at it. And you look maybe at the background, or you look at her smile, or you look at what the baby does, or whatever. And maybe you'll spend 2-3 minutes looking at it, and well, nothing. You just wasted your time. You don't. What's in it? Why is it art? Often, I'm talking about Virgin Mary for classical art, but very often people would go to contemporary museum and say, "Oh, what is it? What was there to see? What's so artsy about it? I could do it," or whatever. So you have all these remarks, which precisely mean that they've invested something in it and they didn't get anything out of it. But if we're ready to do that, and why should we be ready to do that? And how can we value? And here, for me, one word that's very important that we too rarely mention when we talk about attention or attention economy and so forth is the word curiosity. Curiosity. I think there can be an attention economy. I'm not sure there can be a curiosity economy, at least in the way I want to frame it. So this curiosity to say the most important experiences in our lives have been experience of either deception or not connection, or again, categorization, which was uninteresting. And then something happened. You can call it snobism. Very often it could be snobism. Well, they all think it's good. What's so good about it? I have to pay it more attention. Because if I don't say that this is good, I will look like an idiot and so forth. So snobism for me is great because it just pushes you to super invest attention. It's something that you thought you had recognized, and then open yourself to some form of alterity. And that's the other book by Nathalie Deprat. It's very much strange. It's to open to strangeness, to alterity, to the alien. It's an alienation. This experience of alienation, alienating your attention in something that may give you nothing, or that may give you what? Give you another way of paying attention, give you another sensitivity to things that you would not have noticed because they weren't categorized in the set of categories that you carried with you. So this delay of categorization that Deprat or Schaeffer described very precisely. It's like they do it like surgeon with a scalpel and so forth. I think it provides us with very good argument, not just to say, oh, we should enforce art education in school, but how can we make it enjoyable? Because if we think about it, I think a lot of us will realize that this, whether we like modern art or contemporary art or not, in our history, it's these moments of just opening to something alien that is crucial. And if we call that curiosity, and if we try to rethink, in particular, the way we think of education, whether it's at the university or at the primary school level, with this necessity of cultivating, actively cultivating, not so much attention, but curiosity, something will happen. But I think maybe I'm too long with my responses.
No, it's great. It's on. Yes. Okay. No. Thank you so much. Actually, I would go on for hours. I have many questions, but I'm afraid that we will have to close to wrap it up. But I'll send you my last questions via email then.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Yves, for being with us today. And thank you, everyone, for being with us in the auditorium and for those attending via live stream. And I wish everyone a beautiful weekend. Et voilà. Thank you.
Thank you, Joe. Thank you.
Thank you once again. Bye, Yves.
Bye-bye. Have a good weekend. Bye-bye.
Bye.